the Budget Committee's hearing on the costs of climate change, risks to the U.S. economy and the federal budget. I want to welcome our witnesses here with us today. This morning, we will be hearing from Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University, Dr. Solomon Chung, Professor of Public Policy at UC Berkeley and a visiting scholar at Stanford, Mr. Alfredo Gomez, Director of the Natural Resources and Environment Team at GAO, and Mr. Orrin Cass, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. We will now begin with opening statements, and I yield myself 5 minutes. Good morning. As we said, this committee has come to order. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Budget Committee's hearing on the impacts of climate change on our nation's economy and federal budget. I'd like to thank our witnesses also for joining us today. This is a hearing on the future of the country, covering a topic that we cannot afford to ignore. Americans are already feeling the effects of climate change. Homes have been blown away in hurricanes that are increasing in intensity or lost to wildfires that are spreading farther and taking longer to extinguish. Our farmers have endured prolonged droughts, while some states have experienced historic flooding. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's October report warned that if greenhouse gas emissions continue at the current rate, our atmosphere will continue to warm with dangerous consequences. In addition to more destructive storms, wildfires, and droughts, we will experience increasingly acidic oceans, a loss of wildlife, reduced air quality, increased disease exposure, and a drastic decrease in crop production, among other disasters that could permanently reshape our way of life. Climate change is an environmental issue. It's a public health issue. It's a national security issue. And as we'll talk about today, it's increasingly an economic and fiscal issue. It is my hope that when faced with the data and testimony of our esteemed witnesses, we can separate opinion from fact and acknowledge that as a governing body, we must plan for the consequences of a changing climate if we are to avoid future catastrophe. Last November, the 4th National Climate Assessment Report was released, and it painted a dire picture for our future. It concluded that not only is the evidence of human-caused climate change overwhelming, its consequences are intensifying. If no mitigating action is taken, climate change will increasingly wreak havoc on the U.S. economy, human health, and the environment. For example, between 2005 and 2014, we spent an average of $36 billion annually responding to extreme weather and fire events. But that level of spending looks tame compared to where we are headed. For 2018 alone, Congress appropriated more than $130 billion for disaster-related purposes, and all indications are that these costs will continue to dramatically rise in the years and decades ahead if no action is taken. Already, billions of dollars of federal property and approximately half of all U.S. military sites are threatened by climate change. That's not my assessment. That's from the Pentagon's initial vulnerability assessment report on climate-related risk to DoD infrastructure. Major assessments from the Climate Impact Lab and EPA's Climate Change Impacts and Risk Analysis project also concluded that if we continue business as usual with high emissions and limited resilience efforts, annual losses across multiple sectors of our economy could exceed $500 billion, or roughly 3% of national GDP, by the end of the century. The global investment management company BlackRock estimates that the median risk of commercial properties being hit by a Category 4 or 5 hurricane has increased by more than 135% since 1980. This increase could further rise to 275% by 2050, with major implications for commercial mortgage-backed securities. They also add that, quote, extreme weather events pose growing risks for the creditworthiness of state and local issuers in the $3.8 trillion U.S. municipal bond market, end quote. The only people who fail to understand the seriousness of climate change are the Trump administration and some of our Republican colleagues. If they are not moved by environmental, health, and security consequences, I hope the economic costs and the impact on the federal budget will get their attention, because we cannot afford to wait for them to catch up. We can't afford to be the only country that is not part of the historic Paris Climate Agreement. We can't afford to have an administration that continues to deny climate change and handicap the agencies and programs responsible for responding to it, making the problem far worse and ultimately more costly. It is our responsibility as the Budget Committee to review the issues that threaten our fiscal health and our constituents. Without serious action to address climate change, federal spending will continue to rise on everything from federal disaster response to flood insurance, crop insurance, and federal facility preservation and repairs, not to mention the increased public health costs. I hope today's hearing will make clear that we must rejoin our global partners in tackling the threat of climate change and commit to substantial reductions in carbon pollution, meaningful investments in clean energy, and policies that strengthen our communities and prioritize the health and safety of current and future generations. I now just made it under my 5 minutes. Anyway, I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Johnson, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, and I'm going to try and fill some really big shoes and attempt to give an opening statement on behalf of our ranking member who's in appropriations this morning. But I'd first like to request unanimous consent that his prepared opening statement be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
As you've heard, the title of today's hearing is The Cost of Climate Change, Risk to the U.S. Economy and the Federal Budget. But we can't have a hearing about climate change without taking a detailed look at the favored proposal among our colleagues on the left, the Green New Deal. Currently, the Green New Deal has 93 co-sponsors, about a dozen of whom serve on the Budget Committee. Following our hearing last month on Medicare for All, this is our second hearing featuring a central plank of the progressive agenda. I'll be curious to learn what the focus will be at our next hearing if we continue down this path. We're supposed to be the Committee of Fiscal Discipline, the committee that's responsible for managing and addressing our nation's debt. But instead of talking about a budget, something Democrats were unable or unwilling to produce, we're here to discuss a $93 trillion proposal that has been hailed on the left as a massive transformation of our society. Transformation, in this case, should be replaced with upheaval to make the description more accurate. The proposal has been billed as the cure to our environmental challenges. In reality, it would dump tens of trillions of federal dollars into new programs and mandates on families, businesses, states, and localities that will increase energy costs, raise taxes, eliminate jobs, and fail to actually address climate change. The U.S. has been a leader in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we cannot effectively address climate change alone. This is a global issue. China and India accounted for half the increase in global emissions in 2017, the same year that U.S. carbon emissions were the lowest they've been since 1992. Congress should focus on policies that encourage research and development of all sources of energy, such as carbon capture and sequestration, energy storage, small modular nuclear reactors, or hydropower, to name a few. We should break down regulatory barriers to innovation and promote competition with the goal of making clean energy more affordable, accessible, and reliable, creating jobs and growing the economy. In doing so, America will continue to lead other countries in reducing our impact on our climate without adding to our nation's debt and disrupting the lives of American workers and families. Innovation is the cornerstone of America. It's what we do best. But more government interference and less freedom for Americans is the wrong policy to get the results we want. I do want to add that it's not entirely fair to say that there are no ideas on how to pay for the astronomical cost of the Green New Deal. The concept of modern monetary theory has been cited as a solution to all our debt problems because, so the theory goes, the government can just print more money to pay our bills. Now, I'm skeptical of that claim, but I understand that Chairman Yarmouth made some news on this topic in an interview at the Peterson Foundation Fiscal Summit this morning. I'm hopeful a hearing on this theory is on the horizon. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for your opening statement. And I need to apologize to anyone here who is under the impression that this hearing was about the Green New Deal. I know the Republicans put out notices that we were going to have a hearing on the Green New Deal. There are 11 committees that have jurisdiction over that piece of legislation. We're not one of them. As I said, this This hearing is about the economic impact of climate change, and I'm very, very excited that we have four very, very knowledgeable.
Will the chairman yield?
Certainly.
Mr. Chairman, how can we have a discussion, a serious discussion about climate change on this committee without addressing the primary plank of the platform that you and your colleagues have offered, the Green New Deal, to resolve climate change?
Well, as you mentioned, the Green New Deal doesn't even have a majority of the caucus as co-sponsors, but there are hundreds of proposals to deal with climate change, and I think a lot of them are very meritorious, and we ought to consider them. We ought to start by agreeing that there is a problem here, and we need to act responsibly as a Congress to address it. But now I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Once again, each of you will have 5 minutes to present your testimony. Your written statements have been made a part of the record. So I first get to introduce Dr. Hayhoe, and Dr. Hayhoe, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yermuth, Member Johnson, and committee members for inviting me to speak today. My name is Katharine Hayhoe. I am an atmospheric or climate scientist and a professor at Texas Tech University. My research focuses on understanding what climate change means to us in the places where we live. I also spend a lot of time talking about climate change because, according to the Yale program on climate communication, while 70% of us in the US agree climate is changing and it will harm plants, animals, and future generations, only 41% of us believe it will affect us personally. But that's not true. The message of the fourth National U.S. Climate Assessment, or the NCA, is crystal clear. Climate change is already affecting every region of the U.S. and nearly every sector, including our ag, infrastructure, water, and more. Climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's a health issue, a resource issue, and most relevant to this committee, an economic issue as well. So my testimony today highlights the findings of the NCA across the U.S., and of course, I'm speaking on my own behalf, based on my expertise in climate impacts and my role as a lead author of the assessment. This testimony is not a product of the NCA process, the U.S. GCRP, or Texas Tech University. Before I begin our brief tour on how climate change is already affecting the U.S., I want to unequivocally state that contrary to what you may have heard, NCA is not based on a so-called most extreme scenario. It looks at a range of future scenarios, from higher ones, where we continue to depend on fossil fuels, as the world does today, to scenarios so low that we only have a few years left before that ship sails and they're off the table. Which of these is most likely? Over the last 2 decades, it's clear that the observed increase in global carbon emissions has been consistent with the higher scenarios. Looking to the future, though, the question of which scenario is more likely is not one that the science can answer. Instead, the answer is up to us. As NCA concludes, climate change beyond the next few decades will depend primarily on the amount of heat trapping or greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, emitted globally. We humans are in the driver's seat, and we are conducting an unprecedented experiment with the only home we have. Returning to our main theme, though, it's clear that climate change is no longer an issue that can be put on the back burner for future generations. It's already affecting us right now in the places where we live, and one of the most visible ways it's doing so is by exacerbating many of our naturally occurring weather and climate risks. For example, where I live in Texas, hurricanes are nothing new. They're not getting more frequent, but they are intensifying faster on average and getting stronger, bigger, and slower. It's estimated that between 20 to nearly 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey, and a significant share of the over $125 billion worth of damage it caused, was because of a warmer climate. Thanks to sea level rise, sunny day flooding is already affecting property values in coastal cities like Miami. It's estimated by one study that by the end of the century, homes and commercial properties across the US worth over $1 trillion could be at risk. In the Northeast and the Midwest, heavy precipitation is increasing. When the fields are too wet, farmers have to delay their planting by weeks, as happened this very year. Flood risk is also increasing. In Iowa, for example, what used to be considered 500-year floods just 30 years ago are now 100-year floods. Warmer temperatures are also helping invasive species spread northward. In Arkansas, for example, herbicide-resistant Palmer amaranth, known as pigweed, has been called the greatest pest facing cotton and soybean producers today. In the western U.S., the number of wildfires is not increasing, but they're burning twice the area thanks to climate change. In addition to destroying homes and infrastructure, just this past year, PG&E, California's largest utility, cited $30 billion worth of liabilities due to wildfire in their bankruptcy filing. Many more details are available in my written deposition and, of course, in the NCA itself. But the bottom line is this: we care about a changing climate because it is loading the natural weather dice against us. It's taking many of our naturally occurring risks and making them worse in ways that affect us here and now. We are already starting to adapt, but this is a very important qualifier: we're not adapting fast enough. And the further and faster climate changes, the more difficult and expensive, and in some cases, ultimately impossible it may be to do so. That's why it's so important to prepare, to build resilience to the risks we can't avoid, and to reduce our emissions of heat-trapping gases to avoid the risks that we can. The NCA sounds the warning, looking ahead down that road to provide the information that we need to make the good decisions that will ensure a safe future for ourselves, our families, our communities, and us all. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now yield 5 minutes to Dr. Chung.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee for inviting me to speak today. My name is Solomon Chung, and I'm the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and currently a visiting scholar at Stanford. I was trained in both economics and climate physics at Columbia, MIT, and Princeton. My research focuses on the use of econometrics to measure the effect of the climate on the economy. The last decade has seen dramatic advances in our understanding of the economic value of the climate. Crucially, we are now able to use real-world data to quantify how changes in the climate cause changes in the economy. This means that in addition to being able to project how unmitigated emission of greenhouse gases will cause the physical climate to change, we now also can estimate the subsequent effect that these changes are likely to have on the livelihoods of Americans. Although, as with any emerging research field, there are large uncertainties and much work remains to be done. Nonetheless, I'd like to describe to you 7 key insights from this field regarding future risks if past emission trends continue unabated. First, climate change is likely to have substantial negative impact on the U.S. economy. Expected damages are on the scale of trillions of dollars, although there remains uncertainty in these numbers. For an example, in a detailed analysis of county-level productivity, a colleague at University of Illinois and I estimated that the direct thermal effects alone would likely reduce incomes nationwide over the next 80 years, a loss valued at roughly $5 to $10 trillion in net present value. In another analysis, a colleague from University of Chicago and I computed that losses from intensified hurricanes were valued at around $900 billion. Importantly, these numbers are not a complete accounting of impacts, and other notable studies report larger losses. Second, extreme weather events are short-lived, but their economic impact is long-lasting. Hurricanes, floods, droughts, and fires destroy assets that took communities years to build. Rebuilding then diverts resources away from new productive investments that would have otherwise supported future growth. For example, a colleague at Rhodium Group and I estimated that Hurricane Maria set Puerto Rico back over 2 decades of progress. And research done at MIT indicates that communities in the Great Plains have still not fully recovered from the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. As climate change makes extreme events more intense and frequent, we will spend more attention and more money replacing depreciated assets and repairing communities. Third, the nature and magnitude of projected costs differs between locations and industries. For example, extreme heat will impose large health, energy, and labor costs on the south, sea level rise and hurricanes will damage the Gulf Coast, and declining crop yields will transform the plains and Midwest. Fourth, because low-income regions and individuals tend to be hurt more, climate change will widen existing economic inequality. For example, in a national analysis of many sectors, the poorest counties suffered median losses that were 9 times larger than the richest. Fifth, many impacts of climate change will not be felt in the marketplace, but rather in homes, where health, happiness, and freedom from violence will be affected. There are many examples of this. Mortality due to extreme heat is projected to rise dramatically. Increasingly humid summers are projected to degrade happiness and sleep quality. Research from Harvard indicates that warming will likely elevate violent crime nationwide, producing over 180,000 sexual assaults and over 22,000 murders across 8 decades. Colleagues at Stanford and I estimate that warming will generate roughly 14,000 additional suicides in the next 30 years. Increasing exposure of pregnant mothers to extreme heat and cyclones will harm fetuses for their lifetime. These impacts do not easily convert to dollars and cents, but they merit attention. Sixth, populations across the country will try to adapt to climate at substantial cost. Some adaptations will transform jobs and lifestyles. Some will require constructing new defensive infrastructure, and some will involve abandoning communities and industries where opportunities have deteriorated. In all cases, these adaptations will come at real cost, since resources expended on coping cannot be invested elsewhere. Lastly, outside of the US, the global consequences of climate change are projected to be large and destabilizing. Unmitigated warming will likely slow global growth roughly 1/3 of a percentage point and reduce political stability throughout the tropics and subtropics. Together, these findings indicate that our climate is one of the nation's most important economic assets. We should manage it with a seriousness and clarity of thought that we would apply to managing any other asset that also generates trillions of dollars in value for the American people. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and now I'll recognize Mr. Gomez for 5 minutes.
Chairman Yarmouth, Mr. Johnson, and members of the committee, good morning, and I'm pleased to be here today to discuss our work on how to limit the federal government's fiscal exposure by better managing climate change risks. This is an area that has been on our high-risk list since February 2013. The cost of recent weather disasters have shown us the need for planning for climate change risks and for investing in resilience. My statement today discusses several areas where the federal government faces fiscal exposure from climate change risks, the potential impacts on the federal budget, and how the federal government could reduce this exposure. So early this year, we reported that the federal government faces fiscal exposure from climate change risks in several areas, including disaster aid, federal insurance programs, and federal property and land. The rising number of natural disasters and related federal assistance are a key source of federal fiscal exposure, and this exposure will likely continue to rise. Since 2005, federal funding for disaster assistance is at least $450 billion. According to the U.S. Global Change Research Program, disaster costs are projected to increase as certain extreme weather events become more frequent and intense due to climate change. In addition, the National Flood Insurance Program and the Federal Crop Insurance Program are sources of federal fiscal exposure due in part to the vulnerability of the insured property and crops to climate change. From 2013 to 2017, losses under these programs totaled $51.3 billion. The federal flood and crop insurance programs were not designed to generate sufficient funds to fully cover all losses and expenses and need budget authority from Congress to operate. With regard to federal property, the federal government owns and operates hundreds of thousands of facilities and manages millions of acres of land that could be affected by a changing climate and represent a significant federal fiscal exposure. For example, the Department of Defense owns and operates domestic and overseas infrastructure with an estimated replacement value of about $1 trillion. In September 2018, Hurricane Florence damaged Camp Lejeune and other Marine Corps facilities in North Carolina, resulting in a preliminary repair estimate of $3.6 billion. 1 month later, Hurricane Michael devastated Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, resulting in preliminary repair estimates of $3 billion. So while the federal government faces fiscal exposure from climate change, it does not have certain information that's needed to understand the budgetary impacts of such exposure. For example, the federal budget does not account for disaster assistance provided by Congress or the long-term impacts of climate change on existing federal infrastructure and programs. Also, the Office of Management and Budget climate change funding reports do not include information on federal programs with significant fiscal exposure to climate change. A more complete understanding could help policymakers anticipate changes in future spending and enhance control and oversight over federal resources. One way to reduce federal fiscal exposure is to reduce or eliminate long-term risks to people and property from natural hazards. For example, in September 2018, we reported that elevating homes and strengthening building codes prevented greater damages in Texas and Florida during the 2017 hurricane season. The federal government has made some limited investments in resilience. Also, Congress passed the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, which could enable additional improvements at the state and local level. However, the federal government lacks a strategic approach for identifying, prioritizing, and implementing investments for disaster resilience. In summary, the federal government could reduce its fiscal exposure to climate change by focusing and coordinating federal efforts. So we have made a total of 62 recommendations. As of December of last year, 25 of these recommendations remain open. Some of these identify key government-wide efforts that are needed to help plan for and manage climate risks and direct federal efforts toward common goals, such as improving resilience. For example, to make buildings and infrastructure more resilient, we recommended that the Department of Commerce convene federal agencies to provide standard-setting organizations with the best available forward-looking climate information to inform design standards and building codes. Chairman Yarmouth, ranking members, and member of the committee, thank you. That completes my statement.
Thank you, Mr. Gomez. And now I'll recognize Mr. Cass for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, Member Johnson, and all members of the committee for inviting me to testify today. My written testimony discusses climate economics, estimates of climate costs, and appropriate policy responses. I'd like to use my brief time here to provide a concrete illustration of one point in particular, the way in which cost estimates go astray when they fail to account for adaptation, meaning they model an implausible future in which human society takes no action to protect itself against the potential harms of a warming climate. I'll describe one climate cost in particular, which is called extreme temperature mortality, or in other words, people dying from very high or low temperatures. Both of the government's major synthesis reports, Dr. Hayhoe's National Climate Assessment and Mr. Gomez's GAO report, suggest that heat deaths will be one of the largest costs, and in some cases, the largest cost of climate change. Both rely on estimates from the same two studies, one from EPA's CIRA project and one published by Dr. Chung and his colleagues. So let's take a look at those estimates. First, EPA CIRA. The model here considers extreme heat city by city. It takes each city's range of temperatures and defines the top 1% of low temperatures as extremely hot. Cities tend to experience elevated mortality on such days. So for Pittsburgh in 2000, as you see illustrated here, a day with a low temperature above 71 degrees would count. Next, the study applies a projection of warming temperatures under climate change, but it does not update the threshold for a very hot day. Even as the climate warms, the study assumes that Pittsburgh will still react to every day with a low above 71 as extremely hot. The result is many more such days, as you see in the red compared to the blue, and an enormous increase in deaths. The result does not make sense. The 3 bars on the left here show the extreme temperature mortality from the study in 2000 for some of the nation's hottest cities, Phoenix, Houston, and New Orleans. The 3 bars on the right show the projected mortality rate in 2100 from the study for some northern cities, New York, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. Those cities will not be as hot in 2100 as our southern cities are today, yet EPA claims people could be dying at a rate 50 to 75 times higher. The technical term for this is a bad model. Yet EPA, GAO, and the National Climate Assessment all report it uncritically. The second estimate comes from work by Dr. Chung and his colleagues, published most recently in the journal Science. The approach here is different, assuming that all places react the same way to extremely hot days, because climate change will create the most and hottest days in the south. Therefore, you see on the left side of the chart the dark red areas of much higher mortality in the south. The right side shows the study's total estimate of climate cost, also used by the National Climate Assessment. As temperatures get warmer, cost rises. And the blue section, virtually the entire cost, comes from this heat-related mortality. Now, I'd like to show how these estimates might change if we take adaptation into account. First, consider a related study by Barreca et al. That looked at adaptation that has already occurred. For the United States, they found that, quote, the impact of days with a mean temperature exceeding 80 degrees Fahrenheit has declined by about 75% over the course of the 20th century, and that at 2004 rates of air conditioning, it may even be the case that such days would have, quote, no impact on mortality. It is apparent, they write, that, quote, air conditioning has positioned the United States to be well adapted to the high temperature-related mortality impacts of climate change. Notably, the science estimate on the left side uses the data from the study on the right. It just doesn't use the finding that a focus on the most recent data reduces mortality substantially. One more example of how adaptation assumptions affect climate. On the right side is a result from a Climate Impact Lab working paper published last year. Here the authors do focus on adaptation, and importantly, the costs of adaptation as well as the benefits. We shouldn't forget that adaptation has costs as well. But compare the measure of climate change's effect on the Southeast on the left with no adaptation to the effect on the right with adaptation. Now the Southeast is blue. It appears to actually benefit from climate change. The authors write, quote, failing to account for income and climate adaptation as has been the norm in the literature, and here they specifically cite the study on the left, would overstate the mortality costs of climate change by a factor of about 3.5. Speaking specifically about the Southeast US, they say it is, quote, currently so heavily adapted to hot climates that, quote, additional warming leads to limited additional mortality or adaptation costs. These locations then end up benefiting from reductions in a relatively small number of cold days. Let me conclude by emphasizing that none of this means that climate change is not a serious problem or does not require a policy response. It is and it does. But in thinking about it and responding to it, we should recognize that our society has shown a remarkable capacity to adapt to and thrive in a wide variety of climates, some quite hostile for significant periods of the year. Further, our population continues shifting toward the south, actively seeking out warmer climates. Cost estimates that do not account for adaptation are not good estimates, and reports that rely on such estimates can be misleading to policymakers and the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cass. We'll now begin our question and answer period. And Mr. Johnson and I are going to defer our questioning till the end of the hearing. So I will now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to observe that something people may not see on TV, that this place is packed. I see rows of people here listening to this testimony, and I judge that maybe 3 or 4 of them are over 30 years old. This is something that's obviously of great importance to people in this building. This is as packed as the Mueller hearings might be in the Judiciary Committee. Not as many members, but the crowd is certainly interested. And I also want to respond to my colleague, Mr. Johnson, about the Green New Deal. I don't support the Green New Deal for 2 reasons. One is a policy reason. It contains economic strategies and things like guaranteed jobs that are extraneous to climate action. And I think with which I disagree. So, in fact, I think most of the members of this committee on the Democratic side have not sponsored the Green New Deal, probably maybe for that reason, but for the other reason, it's even more fundamental, is that it's divisive. I feel like we are, that people have explained some pretty overwhelming impacts of climate change. Even Mr. Cass suggests they may be overstated, but no one denies that these are issues before us. My mom always told me to pray for the best but plan for the worst. So with respect to you, I'm concerned about what Dr. Hayhoe said. And we need, I think, to make radical change. But I think to do that, to get radical results, we're going to have to moderate our politics. The first thing I heard in here was about the Green New Deal and the cost of it, and I think it's a fact that most of us haven't endorsed it for that reason. I also heard from my own side of the aisle how Republicans are to blame for this, and I don't know whether that's true or not, but I did litigation. That's not what I'm here for. I think we're here to solve problems, and I think we've got a pretty big one in front of us. So I have taken a different approach. I just want to call to your attention to each of the four of you, which is, I was thinking, we've been working on this for a while. I've been in Congress, this is my fourth term. People have all sorts of good ideas about what to do about climate, and I decided to put them together. So I went back and looked for all the, we've done this in conjunction with academics from Duke and Stanford, UCSD. We looked back at all the, ideas, the bills that had been introduced in this Congress and the last Congress. And we compiled them into what we called the Climate Playbook. And for you people under 30, it's the pinned tweet on my official Twitter account. I'd ask you to look at it. But it's it's ideas for reducing emissions from various sectors of the economy, including manufacturing, electricity, transportation, agriculture, promoting energy efficiency, something we can all get behind, and everything except what Mr. Johnson said about the Green New Deal, by the way, I agreed with. Reducing pollution, increasing R&D investment, adaptation and resiliency, there's all sorts of ideas out there that we can get behind today if we get our politics behind us a little bit and start to work together. And I'm going to ask Ms. Hayhoe, is kind of famous for being not just a climate scientist, but also an evangelical Christian. So you're in circles that a lot of Democrats don't travel in all the time, and wanted to know if you had any ideas for me as a Democrat on how we might be able to engage people in really solving this problem, which is bigger than politics.
Thank you. So I am an evangelical Christian. My husband is a pastor. And what I have found is that so often we think people don't have the right values to care, and we need to figure out how to change people's values. But through thousands of conversations that I've had with people in our faith community in Texas and beyond, I realized that we all already have those values. We all care about our families, we care about our communities, we care about people who are suffering today, poverty, hunger, and more. And those are the exact values that we need to care about a changing climate. So it isn't a case of emphasizing what divides us. It is, as you just said, a case of emphasizing what unites us, because that is far greater.
I think that's well said. I think you see this in the evangelical environmental movement is taking this up. And look, I used up all my time talking, but politics is about us. It's not about the world. We're here doing politics ostensibly as a means to an end. And I think we ought to think about that. And I would ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to let's work together, check out these ideas that we've assembled, and see if we can't start making real action. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the gentleman from California just stated, there's only standing room here witnessing this. I also have to point out that it's pretty unfortunate that on this side of the committee, that's where the Democrats sit. And you can see on this side is the Republicans. We're the ones that's here. There's 5 Democrat members, and they're the majority. So they may not be as nearly as interested about the issue that you all are right now. So I just think it's important to notice that. 57 days. 57 days. This committee has went 57 days without passing a budget. Yet this week, we are doing 5 appropriations bills on the floor. The Democrat majority has rendered the Budget Committee useless because we've not done our job, and we're having a hearing on climate change today when we still need to pass a budget. There's not even a budget proposal out there for this committee to vote on other than a Republican budget proposal. Let's do our job. It's 57 days. A budget is the primary responsibility of governing. It's the only document that Congress produces that lays everything out. Revenues, spending, deficits, and of course, our vision for the future. A statement of values, as Speaker Pelosi has called it. Yet after 57 days and counting, we have no statement from the House Democrats. The reason why is clearly obvious. Free college tuition, Medicare for all, guaranteed job, and of course the 93 trillion. The numbers, the Green New Deal that's been discussed for all, just two priorities of the House Democrats, would together cost $20 trillion more than the net worth of every American household. $20 trillion more than the compiled net worth of every American household, over 320 million Americans. Knowing this wish list only scratches the surface, I have no confidence Democrats on this committee can make serious decisions about our federal budget. And they don't seem to have any either. So instead today we're having a hearing on climate change. And what is their proposal to address climate change? The previous mentioned Green New Deal, which more than half of the Democrats on this committee have sponsored. More than half. That's why it should be topic of conversation of this committee. A plan that would cost every American household $60,000 a year. Every American household, $60,000 a year, while not fulfilling its primary objective, which is reducing global carbon emissions. While the plan may fail in its primary objective, it would be very effective in others, mainly in destroying American agriculture as we know it today. If you don't believe it, that's an objective. Look no further than the infamous fact sheet. No one cares more about their land than American farmers and ranchers. Thanks to their innovative solutions, they do numerous things to protect the soil, the water, the habitat. Look at the Missouri Soil and Water Conservation. We do it right in Missouri. Democrats say they want to improve the environment, but if they accept that premise, it's hard to understand why they haven't brought the great trade agreement President Trump has negotiated to the floor. An agreement that would bring back jobs, increase purchases of U.S. agriculture goods, and yes, improve the environment. Thanks to President Trump, our most recent trade agreement is the most comprehensive has the most comprehensive environmental obligations of any previous U.S. trade agreement in history, which also would provide Canada and Mexico to up their standards in protecting our environment. Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, and I would note that while you criticize Democrats for not being interested in this topic, you didn't even address climate change in your 5 minutes. But we'll, I said the Green New Deal. That's not climate change. That's a piece of legislation. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from the state of Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this very important hearing. And I would just say, with all due respect to my very good friend across the aisle, if you really want to know which party cares about climate change, let's look at which party pulled us out of the Paris Accord. Let's look at which party, while they were in the majority in the last cycle, rolled back all of our environmental protections around clean air and clean water. Let's look at which party is putting in charge of major agencies people who literally are lobbyists for the coal industry. And I want to bring this up in the context of, and by the way, I'm a proud supporter of the Green New Deal. It's crazy to talk about it in terms of a cost, because what it is a vision. It's a vision for an absolutely critical issue, one of the top issues in this country and around the world. And we need to have a big vision that matches the scale of the crisis. Last week, the House Intelligence Committee held a hearing on the national security implications of climate change. And something very odd happened at that hearing. Although 3 witnesses testified, only 2 submitted written testimony. That's because the White House took the unusual step of refusing to approve the written testimony of a top intelligence analyst at the State Department, Dr. Rod Schoonover, because it contained information that did not match the Trump administration's views on climate change. This weekend, the New York Times obtained a copy of his original testimony and a copy of his testimony with track changes. I've got the whole document here, from Dr. William Happer, a senior advisor in the Trump administration who works with the National Security Council. He is also a climate science denier. And since we have a panel of climate experts here with us today, I thought I'd take the opportunity for us to look at Dr. Schoonover's testimony and determine whether his positions are in line with the science, not whether they're in line with the opinion of the Trump administration. And so let me start with you, Dr. Hayhoe. You are a top climate scientist and lead author of multiple volumes of the National Climate Assessment. Is Dr. Schoonover correct in his written testimony when he says that, quote, the Earth's climate is unequivocally undergoing a long-term warming trend?
Yes. Chapter 1 of Volume 1 of NCA concludes that global climate continues to change rapidly compared to the pace of natural variations in climate that have occurred throughout Earth's history.
That was a comment that was taken out. And how about when he says 18 of the last 20 years, this is a quote, have been the warmest on record, and the last 5 years have been the warmest 5, according to NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies?
Yes, that information is available, and anyone can see it for themselves in Chapter 2 of Volume 2, which I served as lead author.
So once again, that was something that in the written comments, it was completely taken out and denied as not being science. And how about this one? Ocean waters are also acidifying from the absorption of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Is that a true statement?
Yes, that is summarized in Chapter 13 of Volume 1, which is called Ocean Acidification.
So again, very important facts that were taken out by Mr. Happer. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter a clean copy of Dr. Schoonover's testimony into the record today, since it wasn't entered into the House Intelligence record. And I'd also like to enter a copy of the version with Dr. Happer's track changes, in which all 3 of these facts were deleted.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. In late March, I sent a letter to the National Security Council raising concerns about their decision to assemble an ad hoc committee headed up by Dr. Happer to provide a quote, adversarial review of the federal government's climate science findings. And in that letter, I said, while any president has the right to ignore or act in contradiction to the advice of top government scientists, it is clear that the goal of this ad hoc committee is to undermine legitimate science itself, which will make it more difficult for national security officials to prevent and respond to the changing climate. This administration's interference in this testimony by Dr. Schoonover is exactly what I feared would happen when I wrote my original letter. And I never got a response to that letter, so today I sent a second letter asking for a response to my original letter, which had a series of questions. And I'd like to, Mr. Chairman, enter my new letter and my original letter into the record now.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. The Trump administration's attempt to bury critically important scientific analysis by our top intelligence agents is horrifying and dangerous. It is not the job of the president to actively undermine the work product of dedicated civil servants in our intelligence community like Dr. Schoonover or Dr. Hayhoe, who's done such incredible work on climate science. It really puts our country and the entire globe at risk. And I very much hope that my colleagues across the aisle, if they really care about this issue, will not just show up to this hearing to talk about everything but climate, but will actually work on affecting and reducing, mitigating climate change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad we're having this hearing today. This is a good opportunity for us to explore how these ideas fundamentally and practically won't work in addition to their stunning cost. I take exception to we shouldn't be worrying about the cost. Climate change must be addressed without sacrificing our country's economic and fiscal well-being with destructive policies like the Green New Deal, something we don't apparently want to talk about today. Extreme theories such as the modern monetary theory, which argues that we can simply print more money to correct Congress's fiscal wrongdoing. In my home state of Oklahoma, 1 in 5 jobs is directly or indirectly supported by the oil and natural gas industry. For example, in my district, the Williams Company employs 1,250 Oklahomans. Magellan Midstream Partners employs over 900. Oklahoma's priority on energy dominance has paved the way for local entrepreneurs such as Valerie Mitchell of Cortera Energy and Don Burdick of Oliphant Energy to take on a massive personal risk that results in job creation, giving back to the community, and stimulating Oklahoma's economy. In fact, in 2018, the oil and natural gas industry was also the largest source of tax revenue in my state, directly paying over $2 billion in taxes, including the annual $555 million plus that go directly to education, and almost $90 million that go directly to our state's infrastructure. My home state of Oklahoma's energy industry employs hundreds of thousands of people and generates more than $50 billion annually. Oil and gas companies bring high-paying jobs to Oklahoma and have been the single largest contributor to state revenue in recent years. Under the toxic Green New Deal, we would lose those jobs and the important impact those companies have on my state. While my friends on the other side of the aisle are so focused on advancing some of the most extreme proposals in Washington, they are unfortunately ignoring the demands for jobs in some of their own states. For example, in Minnesota, my colleague, Representative Pete Stauber, has worked tirelessly and been outspoken in the support of replacing an old pipeline, known as Line 3. To make it safer, it is currently corroded only about at half of the capacity, potentially creating roughly 8,600 jobs over a 2-year period, which building trades are saying they're strongly supporting. There's an old and unsafe pipeline which can be improved, modernized, and made more efficient. Yet some of our colleagues prefer forcing a large-scale transformation of society, which the Green New Deal suggests, over the needs of our local communities. Also in Minnesota, mining projects would produce the precious metals used to make wind turbines. Yet some of my Democratic colleagues oppose those initiatives as well. The U.S. then relies on China and other foreign countries with little or no labor protections. This is very sad. It's a shame. Furthermore, several other states are blocking this type of critical energy infrastructure, including New York and Washington State. New York has blocked multiple natural gas pipelines despite its growing Northeast demand for gas, a move that not only impacts Williams' jobs in my district, but also forces New York State to rely on foreign oil, which is more expensive than domestically produced sources of energy and with lesser environmental standards. Blocking those projects denies consumers, even beyond their state's borders, access to more affordable energy. It seems as though some Democrats are listening to radical environmental activists instead of seeking new jobs in their districts and consumers looking for lower energy bills. That said, my questions today are directed to you, Mr. Cass. Toxic Democrat proposals such as the Green New Deal have an astronomical price tag, and yes, it matters, $93 trillion. To pay for it, taxes would be severely raised on every income level. But even these drastic measures would only pay for a fraction of the Green New Deal. Not only is this legislation detrimental to our state's economy and key industries, but it also would destroy the country's economy. As I just expressed, many of our constituents' jobs rely on the oil and gas industry. If we implement the Green New Deal, would our constituents experience job losses?
That would be my understanding of the Green New Deal.
And what would cause that?
Well, the premise of the Green New Deal would be to shift our energy consumption away from conventional fossil fuel sources and toward alternative sources, reducing demand for the conventional sources.
Such as like airplane pilots and those kind of things. We wouldn't be flying anymore, according to the fact sheet, the infamous fact sheet.
I am not sure what to make of the fact sheet.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Thank you for your answer. You know, March 26, 2019, I know there's been a conversation here that many of the Democrats don't support it, but the Senate voted down the Green New Deal by a vote of 0 to 57. And many of those actually endorsed it and co-sponsored it. So in fact, 43 senators refused to even cast a vote at all. So their silence speaks volumes. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on an important topic. And I would, for one, would like to associate myself with the comments made by Mr. Peters about this topic generally. And I will say, before I get to the questions, I am frustrated for all the talk today about the Green New Deal, which is not before us, and modern monetary theory. The truth is that the science on climate change is pretty much universally accepted now in the scientific community and among most people in the country. And the idea that when we're talking about the economic or the fiscal impacts of it, we'd break down not on this side, not on that side of the table, but on this side of the table, having this silly argument, to me is just incomprehensible. We have a problem. It is a significant, it is a persistent, it is a growing problem, and it will continue to affect people in this country and around the world. We ought to work together, I think, as Mr. Peters eloquently said, to try to find real solutions to it. And I do appreciate very much, Mr. Chairman, you having this hearing. I will say, just for me, I represent Rochester, New York, which is on the southern shore of Lake Ontario. In 2017, we had catastrophic flooding. We're experiencing record levels again today. I was with Governor Cuomo and most of his cabinet who had come to Rochester yesterday to announce $300 million being spent by the state of New York. That's on top of $100 million that we spent 2 years ago to help homeowners and businesses and municipalities deal with flooding. There may be a whole host of reasons, but it certainly seems to me weather patterns, record rainfall, snow runoff, and associated weather patterns have had a profound impact just on the state of New York, and will continue to have here. So I wanted, if I might, Dr. Hayhoe, what do we know about how climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of storms, heavy rainfall events? There seems to be a fair amount of opinion, again, on this side of the table about what the severity is. But can you talk about that, both inland as well and affecting the river system as well as coastal, and how attribution science advanced in the past few years?
I am originally from the other side of the lake from you, and Southern Ontario also experienced devastating and unprecedented flooding this year. We know that storms and floods have always happened naturally, but in a warmer world, air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along, as it always does, today there is more water vapor for that storm to sweep up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago. And one of the places that we have seen the biggest observed increase since the 1950s in the frequency of heavy precipitation has been in the U.S. Northeast and the Midwest, which puts upstate New York in exactly the middle.
And I assume you gather data on this, so is there reliable information we can get on as it relates to attribution of weather patterns and increasing temperature?
Heavy precipitation has been informally attributed, or I should say the observed increase in heavy precipitation has been formally attributed to human-induced climate change for quite some time. The signature is very distinct.
It is interesting, that this wasn't my original question, but as I'm thinking about it, I only have a minute and a half left, and I'm sorry for that, but I was recently at the Institute on Sustainability at Rochester Institute of Technology, the world famous. They travel around the world talking about how to reduce the carbon footprint in manufacturing, lean manufacturing, and helping businesses try to get to zero emissions. And they were talking about how, even in a world in which we will clearly combust renewables, there's a whole science around biomass and other ways to generate heat. They talk about the capture, why carbon captured in petroleum and other products is so much of a challenge, because you're releasing centuries and centuries of carbon into the atmosphere. Could you just comment on that? So it helps people, I think, who think about we're still going to be burning biomass, and other, or anyone else on the panel can certainly address it, but the science around that would be helpful.
Yes. So when we burn biomass, trees, crops, agricultural waste, we are burning things that contain carbon that took that carbon out of the atmosphere just years or decades ago. So it essentially is carbon neutral. When we burn coal and gas and oil, we are digging up and burning sources of carbon that have not seen the atmosphere for millions of years. And as the National Climate Assessment concludes, as far back as we can go, at least 50 million years in the past, there has never been a time when this much carbon was being released into the atmosphere this fast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the answer. I yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as always to the witnesses, thank you for being here and for your efforts to prepare yourself for this hearing. I do have questions, and but I feel compelled to make kind of some observations about some of the things I've heard here and in other hearings such as this. I want you to know that I accept that climate change is real. I think we've redefined a little bit what that means. It's changed a little bit, but the climate's certainly always changing. It's something that we need to accept and we need to try to understand. I also accept that human behavior is contributing to it in some way. I can tell you that I've spoken with, including the former director of the EPA and other very, I would hope, knowledgeable individuals on this, and asked them how much of this can we attribute to man and to human behavior, and the answer she gave was, we don't know. And I think that's an honest answer. Some of you are shaking your head, but that's an honest answer. We don't know. Some people think they know, but there is much disagreement on how much of this is directly attributable to man. So the question, I think, is what do we do, and how can we best mitigate this? How can we mitigate the impacts of it? Look, I don't want to beat up on the Green New Deal, talk about beating a dead horse. That horse has, I think, been dead and buried. It's the greatest gift given the Republican Party in a long time in many ways. I believe it's unserious. I think it's based on fear-mongering. I think it's steeped in the heavy-handed government power that would cost to destroy American dream for us and for our children. But I think then what it comes down to is, what do we do? And I just think there's a better way. There has to be a better way. And that's where I'd like to bring then to my question. And I think, Mr. Cass, I perhaps would ask you, among all these projections of the drought and flooding and family violence and heat-related deaths, et cetera, if the earth keeps warming, there are some market solutions to some of these, and I would be interested if any of you have thoughts. Again, Mr. Cass, I would look to you to maybe begin, but help us understand some of the success of free enterprise, democratic and market-driven solutions that would maybe help mitigate some of these concerns.
Sure. I think when we're talking about how to address the problem of climate change, it's important to realize we're having two conversations. One is about what's called mitigation, meaning what can we do to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases we're releasing. And then one is about adaptation, meaning how can we cope effectively with any change that does occur. On both sides, I think free enterprise and innovation can be and have to be central to the solution. So from the mitigation perspective, if we want, in particular, to reduce emissions globally, at the end of the day, it's global emissions that matter, we are going to have technologies for the developing world that are more attractive than fossil fuels. And we don't have those today. And so continued innovation and actually the development of new and better technologies has to be part of the program. On the adaptation side, one of the wonderful things about adaptation is that it tends to happen fairly naturally if people have the right information and if they have the right incentives. So as an example, if someone's a coastal property owner, if they understand the best available scientific forecast for sea level rise, and they understand that they are going to be on the hook if their property faces damage, they will respond rationally by building resilience, by community-wide investing in protection, and potentially in some cases by moving away over time. If they don't have good information, or if they don't have good incentives, if we tell them the federal government is going to pay for whatever happens to them, then they won't react. And so I think on the adaptation side, it's the information and the incentives that policymakers really have to get right.
Well, and I think you're exactly right. I mean, and this is a fairly, some people think this is complicated, but it's really not, and that is the rational behavior of people through incentives. And you can either compel them through a very, very heavy-handed government, or you can incentivize them and expect, as we have for several thousand years, that people will respond rationally in what is in their best interest. And I'll conclude in the last half a minute that I have, and that is to emphasize one other thing you said, and that is this has to be a global solution. Without partners on this, we can't fix this ourselves. And the truth is that our partners are dishonest and disingenuous in their commitment to this, many of them. I don't think China has any intention at all of impeding the growth of their economy for the next 20 years in order to address climate change. I don't think India does either. They have hundreds of millions of people in poverty. They have to live up to the middle class. That is their goal. And they won't allow US policy on climate change to impede them in that goal. And if we don't recognize that we can't do this ourselves and find something that works globally, then we're banging our head against a wall. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thanks. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. The inconvenient truth is that we have a global climate crisis. And whether you call it the Green New Deal or a climate action plan, What we need is bold action, and we need it now. And ignorance and delay and avoidance and denial is not such a policy. Last month, we had carbon dioxide reaching the highest level in the history of human existence. And last week, we had the Trump administration still trying to prevent a State Department official from testifying about the catastrophic potential of human-caused climate change. The Trump administration always prefers political fantasy to science and scientific fact. They've questioned and harassed so many scientists across this country, one agency after another, that you have to begin to wonder if they believe in gravity. Of course, willful ignorance of climate change is not a laughing matter. Across America, we're seeing with our own eyes the impact of inaction, severe and erratic weather, 100-year floods that become 100-month floods, 60 inches of rain in the energy capital of America in a very short period of time, Houston, Texas. West Nile virus and Lyme disease that were once uncommon, afflicting more and more of our neighbors. These changes, of course, will be disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable, our children and our seniors. Since everything is bigger, in fact, in my home state of Texas, the impact of climate change is more far-reaching there. Of course, Texas is the state that produces the most carbon pollution and the most climate deniers, increasingly leading now with the most climate disasters. The National Climate Assessment predicts rapid swings from extreme drought to flood and sea level rise along the Texas coast, twice the global average. In Texas, we've always had 2 summer temperatures, hot and hotter, but now it's just hotter, as we're on track for 30 to 60 days of over 100-degree temperatures every year. Just a little bit of prevention would go such a long way toward cost savings. And there's reference to the marketplace. Well, yes, in the marketplace, one company after another, what insurance company would not consider the impact of human-caused climate change? What business along our coast wouldn't consider that? There are market answers. But in 2017, the 16 extreme weather disasters in the United States had a market impact. They cost over $313 billion. We see companies around the globe that are changing what they're doing. They're expending billions of dollars because they know they could face trillions of dollars in loss. The cost of continuing to do nothing is impacting much more than polar bears and exotic locations in travel magazines. Energy-efficient alternatives shouldn't be the alternative, they should be the standard. Trump always says that he hates losers, but he's picked the losing coal industry. And coal, the war on coal has been very real, and coal has lost. It's lost in the marketplace to cleaner Texas natural gas and renewable energy. Of course, the Trump administration would say that our years and years of record-breaking heat isn't a dangerous sign of climate change. I guess they would call it alternative climate. I believe that we must treat climate change as a national security concern, as have so many senior defense officials. The Green New Deal, while aspirational and imperfect, offers a roadmap far stronger than the do-nothing Republican alternative of rejecting science in favor of obstruction. Just as a little bit of prevention goes a long way toward cost savings, a little temperature increase goes a long way toward disrupting our weather patterns. We've got to do more than just pray for rain in modest amounts. Dr. Hayhoe, I appreciate the testimony of all the witnesses, but as a fellow Texan, I would ask you, since you've testified in front of both the Austin and San Antonio City Councils, do you believe that these local climate action plans are important to adopt in the face of inaction in Washington? And what do you see as the impact in Texas of the climate crisis?
Well, first of all, in our state of Texas, we are seeing that our natural patterns of feast and famine, flood and drought, are being amplified across much of the region. This is affecting our agriculture, our water, our urban infrastructure, and more. City-level plans absolutely make a difference, both in preparing and building resilience to the impacts of a changing climate, as well as to weaning ourselves off the fossil fuels that are the primary cause of this issue. DFW Airport is the first carbon-neutral airport in North America.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Thank the witnesses for taking time out of your schedules to come here and join us today. Ms. Hayhoe, I would say to you, my dad's a Texas Tech graduate, grew up in West Texas, and I'll tell you, I took him to Minneapolis for the basketball game, which seems like a magnanimous and awesome thing to do for your father until you realize that I went to the University of Virginia. So, I was sitting with Jody Arrington, who's the congressman from Texas, from Lubbock, and Texas Tech made a great run, but I appreciate you being here. I do want to pick up on a few things that have been said here today and offer a few thoughts, but first of all, that I think it's really important as we think about this issue to factor in human flourishing and the world, the benefit that is provided for humankind by the clean, abundant energy. You know, in the 1870s, the average American family, 80% of their income was on food, shelter, and clothing. Today, it's about a third. We have seen in the 1955, for example, only 2% of the American people had access to air conditioning. By 1980, it was 50%. Over the last 100 years, deaths from climate-related events have fallen from somewhere in the zip code of 500,000 to 20,000, while the population has nearly tripled. We have created an environment because of adaptation that was previously discussed by witness that is critically important to recognize in the context of what we're talking about. You know, today, however, if you look around the world, you still have 1 billion people, 1 billion, without access to electricity. You have 2.7 billion, 38%, who are using biomass and dung, basically, for fuel for cooking. You've got a half of the world population lacking enough electricity for the essentials that we just take for granted in the United States today. You have hospitals in countries that are not first world countries where you've got doctors having to squeeze bags to keep babies alive on incubators. Here, we don't have that problem. So I would ask for the people, as we're going through these issues, to put a little perspective on the benefits that we have in this world and our lives from access to abundant energy. And then we got to figure out, well, how are we going to get that energy? And if you look at what's been happening in the world where people have sort of bowed down at the altar of the sort of climate change hysteria, instead of dealing with it head on and thinking about making sure there's clean, abundant energy, you have Germany, where retail electricity is up 50% from 2007 to 2017 because of taxes and subsidies. 24 billion euro in 2017 is the cost of the direct taxes and subsidies for renewable energy. The IHS estimated net export losses to Germany due to high electricity prices of 52 billion euros from 2008 to 13. Meanwhile, carbon dioxide in Germany has fallen only 9% from 2003 to 16. Now let's talk about partisanship here. Who produces the most natural gas in the world? I'm proud to say as a Texan, it's Texas. Who produces the most wind energy in the United States? Proud to say in Texas, it's Texas. We got a quarter of the nation's wind energy. We just cracked 19,000 megawatts in December of wind production, but it's still a fraction of our overall peak demand. And it does have consequences in that conversion. And if you think about that, let's talk about balance. Who was doing that? My former boss, Governor Rick Perry. Oh, the dastardly Republicans who bury their head in the sand on energy. We were creating a all-of-the-above approach in Texas, but there are no just magic energy trees. I'm always amazed. I was at an event one time, and there was somebody in the crowd, and they said, "Where are we going to get power if we don't use fossil fuels?" And this person said, "Electricity." Like just magic generation of electricity. We have to have power to have what we enjoy in this world. And you know, I think if you think about on the terms of these impacts, I would say that we got to think about it here in the Budget Committee about what the actual impact will be on civilization if we go down the road of the Green New Deal. We have enormous benefits in terms of life expectancy, in terms of the benefit that we have to our families, our children, jobs, access to hospitals, access to clean air and water. If you overlay the freest countries in the world with a map of those that have the cleanest environments, it's almost a direct correlation. We will lead this fight if we think about what we're trying to produce in terms of access to clean energy and making sure that we've got abundant energy to make our lives better. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Chakowski.
Mr. Cass, I just wanted to ask you a yes or no question. Let me see. That's not it. Where'd it go? I have information here that says the Manhattan Institute has received funding from the Koch brothers, the Claude R. Lamb Foundation, one of the Koch family foundations, reported giving over $2 million to the Manhattan Institute. Is that correct?
I don't know, I'm sorry.
Okay. I think it is. I'm really frustrated in this hearing today. And what I'm hearing is that those people who feel a sense of urgency about what's happening to our planet, actually the planet will probably do better without us, but to the preservation of our species right now, that there is an urgency about this, that in fact, in the last year, and one of you I think can confirm this, that we actually saw an increase in carbon emissions, and I wonder if you could, one of you could talk about that, 3.4% or something like that, last year in 2018. Doctor?
That is correct. U.S. emissions did increase last year, and globally, carbon emissions continue to increase.
You know, 20 years ago, a reporter found that over 20 years ago when I was in the state legislature, I made a speech on the floor of the House about how we have to get serious about this. And then he followed up with me not too long ago. And I said, you know, 20 years and we're going in the wrong direction. It seems to me, am I overstating this? This is existential. This is about the future of the young people that are in this room. I agree in noticing what Congressman Peters did, that young people are here, but that's because what I'm hearing in my district is from young people. Can anybody talk about this in terms of really the why we have to have a sense of urgency now?
The first time that scientists formally warned a U.S. president of the risks and the dangers that climate change posed to our society was over 50 years ago, and that president was Lyndon B. Johnson. It is not, as you stated, our planet that is at risk. It is not even our species. It is our civilization. It is everything that makes our lives worth living, and it absolutely is our economy as well. We have progressed tremendously over the last 300 years, and I'm actually very grateful, personally, for the benefits fossil fuels have brought us. But just as we transition from horses and buggies to automobiles, in the same way we must now transition our energy systems into the future to ensure our continued security.
So the President of the United States, when he was running for office, said that he would break the Environmental Protection Agency into little tidbits. That's what he talked about. There's a hearing going on also in Energy and Commerce on what's happening to the Environmental Protection Agency and the kinds of changes that have happened. What should we be expecting from regulation right now? I'm worried about the Midwest. That's where I'm from. We have floods. Many of our farms are underwater. But I'm also worried about climate refugees, because I think we're seeing that already. And if we want to stop people coming from places where they can't farm anymore to the United States, we better do something about this. What do we need to do in terms of regulation?
I think at present we are very poorly equipped from an institutional standpoint to cope with what we might expect to see in terms of the influx of migrants coming from other countries, as well as the internal displacement of Americans. I think the Dust Bowl is maybe the closest analog we have to what we might expect to see in the Midwest, with roughly a 25% chance. And so thinking about the movements of our own internal populations trying to cope with climate change, it is a form of adaptation, and it is incredibly costly to the people who have to pick up and move their lives.
So I'm sitting on Lake Michigan Is someone going to be coming after this source of water? Are people going to be moving?
It seems implausible that the places where people are currently conducting agriculture and making their livings are going to be the same places in the future where people can continue to make livings.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll pick up where Ms. Schakowsky left off. Given that you have about 25% of the world's fresh water close by, I can promise you that we in the Deep South will be coming for your water one day, and I just want to prepare folks for that. I also want to ask Mr. Cass the easy yes or no question. I actually have two for you. If Ms. Schakowsky is able to wrangle up some dollars from anywhere on the ideological spectrum to help you do your research, are you willing to accept those dollars?
I have no role in fundraising at the Institute, so you'd have to ask them.
Then I'll ask the opposite question. Does the quality of your research vary based on where the funding for the Institute comes from?
No.
I tell you, I've been incredibly pleased, Mr. Chairman, with this hearing. I did not expect to come and be inspired, but I really have been. Dr. Chung, it was your testimony about managing the climate, managing the Earth as an asset that got me started in the right place, because I think that's something we can agree on up and down the ideological spectrum. We all understand managing assets, and managing assets doesn't mean there's a foregone conclusion of where we're going to go. It just means we're going to try to maximize that ability. Dr. Hayhoe, for you to say it's not about preservation of the species, it's about preservation of the civilization. There is a quality of life here that we're operating on too. I think there's just so much that we can agree on. I put back up Mr. Cass's chart here because I do have a complicated time sorting through which facts are the facts and which facts are the angle. Does anybody disagree with what he has put on the board here to say that the research is projecting that Pittsburgh is going to have 12 deaths per 100,000 because of extreme heat, but Phoenix today only has 0.17? Does anybody disagree with those conclusions?
In a careful review of Orrin Cass's earlier work, we were unable to confirm these numbers.
But I mean, we're talking about orders of magnitude here, that yes, if I look at the numbers on the right, I'm incredibly frightened. But when I look at the numbers on the left, I'm incredibly comforted that there should be some sort of agreed upon metric. Now, you don't have to agree it's 12.8 instead of 12.7, but is double digits right on the one hand and fractional digits right on the other? Again, if we can agree on that foundationally, it just seems that it offers us a different place to have a conversation.
I think the three bars on the left do not come from a peer-reviewed analysis, and in fact, I have no idea where they came from, and we were unable to confirm them when we tried to understand what Orrin Cass did in his earlier calculations.
Mr. Cass, sure.
Yes. In my paper that I assume he was referring, it cites specifically to the website at EPA that provides a downloadable spreadsheet from which those numbers come. And could I also add that the 2017 version of the EPA study actually provides a map that shows these numbers in circles, and you can go straight to the EPA study and find the map that shows in the year 2000, those are the values, and in the year 2100, those are the values.
Well, I would just share with you, this whole conversation about adaptation, it's the first time I've heard it from a witness panel. Generally, my chairman accepted. When we call witnesses, we sometimes get the most extreme views on both sides, and the opportunity for conversation is eroded. But yes, I'm not talking about stopping everything I'm doing today. We are going to continue to progress. Let me ask about nuclear energy for a moment, because carbon is our baseline. We're getting ready to move an energy and water appropriations bill to the floor of the House. It contains zero money for licensing Yucca Mountain. As you know, that's a political issue. We've spent billions out there. This isn't to open it. This is just to license it, to finish the studies. If we opened it today, it would be full because we have so much nuclear material across the country that needs to be stored. Is it the position of folks at the desk? Do we have a position in terms of addressing climate change on supporting nuclear energy and thus providing safe storage? Dr. Hayhoe, do we have a position?
There is not a formal position among climate scientists, but I can tell you for sure that it doesn't produce carbon pollution.
We used to be the largest coal-burning state in the nation. We're on our way to being having more solar generation and more nuclear generation than any other place. But I need that all of the above strategy to work with. I appreciated what you said about renewables in terms of forestry too. In Georgia, trees are crops just like corn and cotton are. You don't clear cut your land and leave it there. You manage it. You cut it once, you cut it again, you replant, you do all of those things to be a good steward of the land that you love. But the EPA has grappled with that. The European Union is grappling with where to continue that. Is it an agreed upon, settled conversation here in the States that biomass is in fact carbon neutral?
It depends on how it is grown. If more energy is putting into growing it than burning it, no.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, you've been generous. I thank you very much. And I thank you all for the conversation today.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and to the ranking member as well, and to my colleagues. It is important that every single committee that has jurisdiction on this question, I believe, should be engaged in the question of climate change, because it is a impactful condition that is going to skew the economic health of the nation. And it certainly, for me, poses a serious question why everyone is not looking, reviewing, and researching, and that those who are climate deniers as to the impact, I would argue vigorously or suggest further in-depth consideration of the numbers I'm about to give you. In 2018, we had $306 billion in cost from natural disasters. 16 disasters were $1 billion plus in costs. We were dealing with 5 of the warmest years. Just those mere facts and the evidence of what I witnessed as an impacted individual and my constituents in Hurricane Harvey, which saw 51 trillion gallons of water to create an ocean in the city of Houston. Now, I want to say to my friends in energy that I represent those constituents as well. What I've said to the multinationals is let everybody know that you are engaged in research on climate change and renewables. Let everybody know that you are aware, because of your scientists, of what can transpire as relates to this issue of climate change. I don't know how anyone can proudly claim themselves a denier. They did not walk in my shoes. They did not walk in the 1,200 to 1,500 people who died in Hurricane Katrina, the 3,000 to 4,000 who died in Puerto Rico, only to be discovered way late when Harvard University used its research to determine how many died, and obviously wildfires, and the massive flooding that just occurred in America the last 3 weeks across the landscape of the Midwest. So I believe this is a crucial and important discussion. Let me quickly, I'm going to give 3 questions, and if you can answer them, and I'll give them all at this point. Dr. Hayhoe, how is climate change expected to impact water supplies, drought, and wildfires in various regions of the country? And why are we seeing both increased flooding and increased drought, i.e. in the state of Texas, Austin, and that west area or mid of the state area? We're seeing that. Dr. Hussain, if you would comment on the estimate that the future costs of inaction on climate change could reach roughly 3% of the national GDP annually by the end of the century. What is the right way to think about these estimates and the way we should use them to plan for the future? And then I want to ask Mr. Next gentleman. Sorry, can't see your name right now. If you would follow up on the same comment about the cost of climate change, and you may incorporate something else. My time is short, but if you all could go ahead, I yield to you on the answers, that this is an imperative that we understand this.
Wherever we live, our precipitation follows natural patterns of wet and dry, wet and dry. If we live in Texas, it follows natural patterns of wet and dry and wet and dry. And as the planet warms, this natural pattern is being stretched in both directions. Warmer air means more water vapor. When a storm comes along, it picks it up and it dumps it on us, creating heavier rain. When the storms don't come along during drought, it means longer and stronger droughts.
Doctor?
I would like to confirm that the number you mentioned is in the reasonable range of previous estimates. Thinking about what large fractions of GDP could be lost from climate change is like thinking about just paying a tax, except you get nothing in return. So we estimate that just replacing destroyed assets during hurricanes in the state of Florida is going to cost roughly 12 grand a year. And it only costs 14 grand to go to Berkeley, where I teach. But instead, you'll just be replacing broken things. You won't be getting an education in return.
So a massive cost. Dr. Gomez, you're with the U.S. Accountability.
Sure. From our perspective, we look at climate change from a fiscal exposure, and so we've reported in the variety of areas in which the federal government is exposed, being a owner of facilities, an insurer of property, and also crop insurance, and then also in the provider of disaster aid. I just wanted to mention in your question about impact on water supply. So GAO currently is doing an audit at the moment looking at the resiliency of water infrastructure systems across the country. You mentioned how Houston was devastated by it and how its own water infrastructure was affected.
Yes.
So we are looking at ways in which some water systems are building resilience into their structures. So we hope to get that report out to you folks soon.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
I thank the chairman.
Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My generation cares a lot about climate change and a clean environment, and so I too care about it. We have a vested interest in developing cleaner energy and ensuring that the air we breathe is clean. No one would dispute that, despite the highly dishonest claims about denialism from the other side. That kind of language is meant to divide and cause resentment. But I also have an interest in getting to the truth of the problem, the actual costs we can expect, and the most reasonable, efficient, and plausible solutions. This is where our two sides differ fundamentally. The narrative on the left is that catastrophe is looming and that no cost is too high. Well, of course, this isn't true. Costs do matter. Proper estimates of our ability to adapt to climate change matters. Common sense analysis of the problem does matter. A true cost-benefit analysis free from political bias does, in fact, matter. So let's do away with some of the most absurd claims right away. For instance, that climate change will cause not just heat-related deaths in massive numbers, but hundreds of thousands more murders and sexual assaults. That's what was testified earlier. Is this a serious claim? No, it isn't. Of course it isn't. You make such a claim if your goal is to torpedo good discussions right off the bat. Warren Cass, here testifying today, has already done an excellent job debunking the bad and frankly highly dishonest economic modeling used to come up with those absurd numbers, so I won't dwell on that. I do want to dwell on real solutions, not insane Green New Deal solutions based on a false premise, not a Paris climate agreement which foolishly undermines the most innovative economy in the world, the United States, while freeing up China and India to continue pumping out emissions, or any other ridiculous solutions that rely solely on solar and wind. These are feel-good solutions. They're based on flowery notions of vision and purpose, as opposed to serious policy ideas. Serious policy ideas will take advantage of the greatest innovation machine the world has ever known, the U.S. economy. We should be focused on providing the world with cheap, clean energy that can thrive in the marketplace. The U.S. is responsible for around 15% of global emissions. That is what a Green New Deal would address, 15%. For an enormous $93 trillion price tag, you address just a fraction of the problem. We should be addressing 100% of the problem, and the only way to do that is to export our expertise. In Houston, we have a privately backed investment, like the Net Power plant. It's in LaPorte, right outside my district. This plant burns natural gas to generate electricity, which is already cleaner than most fossil fuels and is readily available in the Permian Basin, just 2 hours away from Texas Tech. Thing is, this natural gas plant has 0 emissions. It captures the carbon it emits and recycles it into the power plant. No emissions, and it's self-sustaining. Natural gas fracking has had an enormous impact already, reducing our emissions greatly. What if we did a better job exporting clean natural gas to dirty coal-burning countries like China and India? Well, we can answer that. The Department of Energy estimates that the promise of natural gas plus carbon capture is so great that if China and India switched just their coal-burning boilers to natural gas, they would reduce emissions by 43%. Add in full-scale turnover to natural gas and carbon capture, and you're looking at an 88% reduction in carbon emissions. More natural gas exports, carbon capture technology, modular nuclear reactors, research on nuclear fusion, these are the future. They work, and they can make our air cleaner, keep growing our economy, and provide sustainable energy for our growing global needs. We must also invest in adaptation, as human beings have been doing for thousands of years. There's a reason that climate-related deaths have dropped drastically over the last 100 years, by around 90%, even though our population has increased by orders of magnitude. We must have realistic projections of the costs of climate change, followed by realistic solutions. That's the way forward. My time for a question. Ms. Hayhoe, if I may give you one question. There's a lot of estimates on the cost, but what I never hear, and what I think the right question to ask is, if we implemented the most extreme solutions, let's just assume the Green New Deal. Let's assume 0 emissions in 10 years coming out of the United States. What would be the effect on the global, what would be the global effect of that? What would be the temperature effect? What would be the effects after that? Do we measure those things?
First of all, if you look at cumulative emissions, which is what climate does respond to, the U.S. is responsible for just under 30% of those. If the U.S. eliminated its emissions, it would actually have an impact beyond its current 15%, because as you pointed out, that technology would percolate around the world, and that leadership would have a huge impact in places that are emerging economies and developing.
What technology? What technology does the Green New Deal create?
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Now recognize the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. One of the areas that really hasn't been explored today is the impact of climate change on the poor and marginalized communities. And with all due respect to those who want to focus on one proposal, I'd like to focus on the people who are actually impacted. Extreme heat conditions and increases in air pollutants negatively impact the health of my constituents, increasing cardiovascular and respiratory illnesses, and even more alarmingly, sometimes leading to premature death. Further, these incidences of illness are having a devastating impact on people's quality of life, to live a healthy life, to be able to raise their family, and to work. In my home state of Nevada, a desert state, it is particularly vulnerable to the changing climate. In Nevada, we face droughts, particularly impacting Lake Mead, which supplies water to roughly 25 million people across Nevada, California, and Arizona. 46% of Nevadans live in areas that face dangerous wildfires. And Nevadans face an increasing number of heat waves. By 2050, it is projected that the city of Las Vegas will experience 106 days per year with temperatures upwards of 105 degrees Fahrenheit. In fact, if you open the newspaper today, we are experiencing a severe heat wave with temperatures over 105 degrees through Thursday. The consequences of climate change disproportionately affect pregnant women, children, the elderly, and disabled minorities and poor communities. So Dr. Chung and Dr. Hayhoe, what evidence is there confirming that climate change will have more severe impacts on low-income and other vulnerable and marginalized populations?
The best description I have heard of climate change is that coined by the US military, which calls it a threat multiplier. It takes issues like poverty, illness, lack of access to clean water, economic hardship, and it exacerbates them in very specific ways.
We are now able to measure these types of inequality that you're describing. For example, you can take a wealthy family and a poor family and have them try to experience the exact same heat wave. And because the wealthy family has more resources to cope with it, maybe they can go to the movies to stay cool or do something else, the poor family is then struggling and often substituting away from other types of things that they would need to spend on. They might take money out of their clothing budget or their food budget to try and cope with some sort of disaster. So there's mounting evidence that climate change and the events that come along with climate change will actually widen the existing inequality across the country today.
You talked about inequality as far as health and quality of life. What about income inequality and how climate change is impacting people in the United States?
That's a very good question. For example, we often see that lower income households are participating in industries where they are exposed to outdoor temperatures for long periods of the day. So people working in agriculture, people working hard in construction, those individuals are the most heavily impacted in terms of their ability to work and earn a living for their families when exposed to increasingly adverse outdoor conditions.
So you touched on agriculture and construction, which are two major industries in Nevada, also leisure and hospitality, which is the largest economic sector in Nevada, accounting for 27% of our workforce. So can you elaborate further on how more extreme temperatures will cause lost working hours for outdoor laborers, particularly those working in these industries, and how they're impacted?
Absolutely. We have numerous studies using government data on how much work people are able to supply, how many hours people are allowed to work and earn their wages. And we find that people, when the temperatures start exceeding 80 degrees, temperatures regularly experienced in Nevada, we see that people start being able to work less, and the time that they're working, they're less productive. So their employer is also getting less bang for their buck in terms of paying these workers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I appreciate you holding this hearing on the devastating impacts that climate change is causing to individuals, but I think particularly those who are in marginalized communities and from poor communities deserve to have a voice in this process, and we need to have a policy that works for them as well. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I've only been here about, I guess, less than 120 days, so I haven't been here long enough to be bitter towards anybody, so my comments will be, I'm sure if you check back with me after 200 days, and I might have changed my position. So, and I appreciate all these young folks here, and I want to encourage you all, because what ends up happening in my 100+ days of being here is, one side points the finger at the other, and the other one does the other, and then we all go out and issue a press release, and we tell our folks back home, look what we're doing, and nothing gets done. Nothing gets done. And I'm a conservative. I have and like this young lady, I try to be a Christian. I'm on the forgiving end, and I appreciate you, because we all need to be good stewards. But I'm also a capitalist, and thought he was coming up and take the mic away from me. But we talk about the Chinese and the Indians. The Chinese are putting 300 new coal plants online. You talk about pollution, and their safety controls are probably something that we would have not done in the 70s. India, the Ganges River, their most sacred river, it's horribly, horribly polluted. Their landfills have been described as time bombs. And I want to encourage you young people, and I'm a capitalist, as I stated, but I think capitalism plays a huge role in this. At one time, I was the mayor of Knox County, and I used to read these statistics, and we generate about 1 tire per person per year. And if you can figure out what to do with those tires, young folks, Bill Gates will be calling y'all for a loan, because
the devastating effect of those things that you just see every day, and it just kind of gets ingrained in you, and you don't pay it much attention. And I would encourage, as I've done since the 70s, to compost. You always talk about, what can we do? We're not going to do a dadgum thing up here. You all are going to have to do it. And you should do it in your own communities. You should compost. You should recycle. And make sure you get the ratio 20-1, because if it goes the other way, you get that awful smell. Then you are putting some very noxious gases into the atmosphere outside of just the carbon that you get in a 20-1 ratio when you turn it. I think God has given us some great solutions. I just think we've turned our back on Him in more ways than one, and we're not looking at what's going on around us. And I do represent East Tennessee, and East Tennessee is home to Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the Tennessee Valley Authority. And I'm wondering, and they both have a huge influence on our nuclear power, or nuclear power, as some people say. And I'm wondering, the question is, I'd like to ask every member just a quick, short answer. Do you all support nuclear power, and where do you see improvements in it, possibly in the funding? We can start here and just go down the line. That'd be all right.
Yes, I do. I think we need to fund more innovation on new reactor types, and we need to make sure it's eligible for any subsidies that other zero-carbon technologies are eligible for.
Right.
So at GAO, we don't take a position, sir, on energy, but we do audits on any type of energy that Congress wants us to look at.
All right. Safe answer. Thank you.
I don't have a position on nuclear power, but I think careful economic analysis indicates that it is is becoming increasingly expensive, and the rate of return on those investments to the ratepayers tends to be declining over time.
And as a climate scientist, I am in favor of any form of energy that does not produce carbon, can be done safely, including both operations and disposal of waste, and can be done cost effectively. And I think that's where the biggest improvements remain to be made in nuclear. But the small modular reactors that have been mentioned previously are a positive step in that direction.
Thank you. And Oak Ridge National Laboratory is leading the way in that direction, and I look forward to them in the future. Mr. Cass, where do you see the free market? See, there you go. We're out of energy already. Where do you see the free market having the biggest impact in the United States energy markets?
In terms of innovation and new technologies?
Yes, sir.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be private sector innovators that are going to drive a tremendous amount of, somewhat on the research, certainly on the development and the deployment side. And so they need to they need both a good flow of research and new technologies coming toward them from the universities, and then they need to be facing a market where they'll have a chance to enter and compete.
Thank you. And you young people, don't get bitter up here. Y'all get out and solve the problems, all right? Thank y'all. I've become an old man. I'm 54, and I'm calling these folks young people, Mr. Chairman. I've become my father, but thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. So Dr. Sheng and Dr. Hayhoe, are you all offering flowering ideas in solving our climate crisis?
I'm a climate scientist, and we are really good at diagnosing the problem, telling you what's happening, why it's happening, and how bad it's going to be. But we are not a one-stop shop. We need everyone. We need engineers. We need business people. We need innovators. We need creators. We need all of us really on board to fix this thing and to make sure that we end up in a better place in the future, not worse.
I think the entire field of economics uniformly agrees that what we need is to somehow find a way to put a price on carbon. And in fact, it's a market solution which is consistent with aligning everyone's incentives with increasing national and global welfare. And so most of the research that we are conducting at the Climate Impact Lab and a huge amount of research at Berkeley is trying to understand what is the appropriate price to put on carbon. And there's a variety of options. You can do cap and trade options, you can charge something at the pump. There's lots of ways to deal with it. And I think the moment you put a price on carbon, markets will respond instantly. Markets are very efficient. They know how to move resources around. It is a very effective strategy.
In your testimony, Dr. Singh, you say that the estimate for the Hurricane Maria will set Puerto Rico back 2 decades of progress. What would be like the cost associated with trying to catch up that progress that could have been made for 2 decades?
Just to be clear about what that statement was trying to say, what we see is when communities are struck by hurricanes, they lose a lot of assets, things that they've spent a long time accumulating, things that are productive, businesses close. And so if you were to look at the trajectory of Puerto Rico over time, it was increasing steadily, and then it gets hit by a storm, and what we expect is that it will never catch up. It's kind of like when you're riding your bicycle with your friends.
Yeah.
If you slow down for a short period of time, you fall behind. And even if you get going at your original speed, you never catch up with your friends unless you pedal a lot faster for a while to catch up. And so what we would need to do is we'd actually need to gas the economy a lot. We need to put in a lot of investments to sort of reinflate all the things that were lost. And so right now, we are not on track to do that.
I mean, so we're not only talking about the cost associated with the loss of infrastructure. We're not only talking about the cost associated with the loss of business. We're also talking about the cost associated with the loss of the human life that would have been able to create that production as well.
Yes, a lot of the research out there indicates that actually the loss numbers you see in the newspaper in terms of damages from a hurricane are roughly only 1/10 of the actual economic loss. Most of the loss shows up as foregone earnings in future decades. But most people are not very good at keeping track of money they didn't earn, right? But what we see is that that's actually 10 times the cost of the number that you read in the newspaper as the damage, which is really just counting for sort of buildings and structures that have fallen down in a very short period of time.
Yeah, I mean, so let me get back to what one of my colleagues earlier was trying to address so eloquently from the point of view of what this means for poor communities. We know that there is a cost associated with the kind of crisis that's being created because of pollution. In my district, one zip code, 55411, has the highest asthma hospitalizations in the state. And these are communities that are mostly African American. And, you know, we're talking about 230,000 asthma attacks in children, 188,000 missed school days and work days each year. There is cost associated with that, as you have pointed out in some of your research. It seems like we are investing and subsidizing the fossil fuel industry and it exacerbating this problem. So there's a double cost to society. How do you propose we mitigate that?
Again, as I said before, I think we need to put a price on carbon.
I have a proposal to get rid of this welfare system to the fossil fuel industry. I think it is really important for us to take a stance and make sure that we're making investments in poor communities around our country. And in regards to composting, I also have a zero waste grant bill that will help communities get that going. And so I'm hoping my colleague will help sponsor that so we can try to make sure that we are doing our part in having a sustainable environment. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, the Vice Chairman of the committee, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was one of the first members of Congress to sign on to the Green New Deal as a signal to what a priority it must be for America to lead the world in addressing climate change. But But I also signed on when it was an empty framework, and I believe it is critical that the Green New Deal focus on 3 major goals. First, investing in carbon-free energy technologies and other green technologies to lead the world in decarbonizing our country. Economically efficient policies like a carbon tax will incentivize the private sector to help. Massively increasing our deficit, as some colleagues of mine have proposed, will not help. 2, while America should set the pace for the developed world, the share of carbon output coming from the developing world increases every year. We therefore need to develop the distributive power technologies necessary to bring carbon-free power to rural communities around the globe. 3, we need to develop carbon capture technologies. Although some activists believe doing so gives us an excuse to keep polluting, the truth is that it is already too late to live without carbon capture because of how much carbon we've already released into the atmosphere. Doing these things is the boldest way to stop climate change, and it will grow American jobs. The two should go hand in hand. We've already broken our climate. We don't need to break our economy to fix it. Now, I'd just like to ask a few questions of some of the members of the panel, starting with Mr. Gomez. Mr. Gomez, what are the largest sources of carbon-free energy in the United States today?
Sure. So according to the Energy Information Administration, last year, in terms of total energy consumption, 12% comes from renewables and 8% comes from nuclear.
Great, thank you very much. Now, Mr. Gomez, with regards to national security, GAO declared the federal government's fiscal exposure to climate change as high risk and estimates the value of infrastructure owned and operated by the Defense Department worldwide to be about $1 trillion. In January, Defense reported roughly 2/3 of mission-critical installations are vulnerable to current or future climate impacts. What would be the cost of building new infrastructure or moving facilities to preserve our national defense strategy?
That's a really good question, and I don't believe that GAO has estimated that cost yet, but as you said, there is a really large infrastructure with a high asset value. We focused on making recommendations to the department to better prepare its facilities, to make sure that it's building in resilience, but also that it's incorporating climate change risks to its everyday planning that they do for their facilities so they can be better prepared.
I can tell you as a Marine veteran that when I visit installations around the world, American military officials, American general officers repeatedly advise us about the national security threat of climate change. Dr. Chung, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated with high confidence that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no or limited overshoot would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in infrastructure, including transportation. To what degree are we currently making transportation investment decisions based on limiting climate change?
That is primarily outside my expertise, but I would say from what is visible, very limited progress in that regard.
I mean, it's interesting to think about a country like France where a high percentage of travel, relatively speaking, is done by high-speed rail running off of nuclear power plants. And so you essentially have a fast, modern, way faster than anything we have in the United States, transportation system that is carbon-free. Mr. Cass, I want to give you a chance to chime in here as well. Our president tweeted that, quote, "The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive," end quote. Mr. Cass, do you agree with the president's assessment?
No.
So how is it that people are going to make rational decisions if the president of the United States is providing completely irrational assessments like that?
I think there are unfortunately a lot of counterproductive and irrational statements made by both people who refuse to accept what scientists are telling us about climate change and those who wildly overstate the problem, and that, for instance, Bernie Sanders saying
So
that
you would put President Trump in the category of people who refuse to accept the reality of climate change?
I have not spoken with him about it. That's how I would characterize that tweet, certainly.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. So Mr. Womack is not going to be coming to the committee. He would normally question at this time. So instead of that, and since the two of us are the only members remaining, Mr. Woodall is going to be allocated 5 minutes to make a closing remarks, and then I'll conclude with my questions.
Because we do have such a learned panel here, is there anyone here who believes we should be setting climate policy based on anybody's last tweet that goes out the door? Is Twitter the best foundation for good climate policy that we have? I really am grateful that you all are here. I wanted to ask the audience that's behind you, though. You all are protected. You're in the circle of trust here on the Budget Committee, but also the camera's facing this way instead of that way, so you will not be on the hook for anything that you do. But I just wanted to get a show of hands. We talked about the urgency of climate change. Who feels the urgency that is here today? All right. They let the record reflect that's a lot of hands, Mr. Chairman. They put those hands down. We've also talked a lot about nuclear today, most recently with the gentleman from Tennessee. How many folks think that part of our strategy going forward is going to include nuclear energy? All right, fewer hands, but still a lot of hands. I was with one of my Democratic colleagues the other day, and she said, "Rob, we're never going to do a big public works project like the Hoover Dam again because you Republicans just refuse to pay for it." And I said to her, "No, I'm happy to pay for it, but you refuse to give me the permits to build it." How many folks, we still have some hydro opportunities here, but we haven't built major hydro projects in a long time because of environmental concerns. How many folks would say that expanded hydro is part of our pathway forward? I've got many fewer hands this time around. You all might not have seen all the urgency hands that went up, but I have a tough time in this business of compromise that is Washington, D.C., melding the urgency with the, oh, but we can't do it that way, and no, that shouldn't be part of the solution. Dr. Chung, you said your opposition to nuclear was that the economics weren't there as they should be, but you expressed great faith in the free market. If we moved to a carbon tax, my concern is we don't take our thumb off the rest of the scale. We would continue to have laws that disadvantage hydro. We would continue to have laws that disadvantaged nuclear. In your vision of a carbon tax that would immediately bring the market forces to bear to solve the problem, would you see a repeal of all of the other laws that put their thumbs on the scale of what the outcome of energy choice should be?
I think whether or not we put a price on carbon is unrelated to whether or not we do or do not choose to change any other policies in the market. But just to clarify my earlier statement, I have no particular opposition or support for nuclear power. All I was stating is that the price has, relative to other energy sources, been rising, and so the investments seem to have a declining rate of return over time. That's all.
Let me ask you, Mr. Gomez, because I know you can't talk policy, but you're absolutely right about federal exposure. I certainly think of that as something that would bring us together on both sides of the aisle. In fact, on the Budget Committee 4 terms ago, we tried to begin budgeting for disasters, saying let's look back over the last 3 years of disasters and put that amount of money, the average, aside for next year. We do a terrible job of budgeting for disaster. Does your examination of that lead you to any conclusions why, again, should be a shared value? We've struggled to better budget for tomorrow.
So we make recommendations to agencies, right, to improve and to get more information. So we have some recommendations outstanding exactly to that point. So we've recommended that the Office of Management and Budget, for example, in their funding reports that they provide to Congress, provide information to you all on those programs that face growing fiscal exposure. So then you can then make trade-offs as you look at the information to see what to focus on, both in the short term and the long term.
There's not a single serious problem up here that I've seen solved without trust amongst folks. And sometimes I show up at hearings that erode that trust, and sometimes I show up at hearings, much more rarely, that build that trust. Going back to your closing statement, Mr. Cass. There are those things that are not helpful when folks ignore the world around us. And there are also those things that are not helpful when folks seek to scare the dickens out of us. I can go down a laundry list of public policy decisions that can be framed in exactly that way. I just want to thank you all. I do believe, Mr. Chairman, while we have virtually zero jurisdiction in this space outside of what Mr. Gomez has come here to try to get us to focus on, I do not believe there will be another hearing on this topic that has as much opportunity to provide a pathway forward among folks who still continue to have substantial policy disagreements. And I thank you all for the role you play in that. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I now yield, Mr. Panetta sneaked in, so I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that introduction and using the appropriate word of sneaked rather than snuck. Thank you. Gentlemen, ma'am, good afternoon. Sorry I have not been here. I had some other obligations. But obviously, thank you for your presence here, and more importantly, thanks for your preparation to be here. I know it takes a lot, but obviously, with your expertise, I'm sure it's a lot easier for you to be here than it would be for many of us in this room. So thank you very much. I'm just going to kind of dive right into it. Dr. Yang, if you could, I know in your testimony that I read, you spoke about the substantial net negative impacts of unmitigated climate change on the U.S. economy. I come from Central Coast of California, Monterey, Big Sur, Santa Cruz, what I would contend is the most beautiful district in the nation. Others would disagree, but I would not, especially if you've been there, you'd understand. But could you elaborate on the economic costs of climate change on coastal homes and businesses, such as my community, and explain, if you can, what fraction of these costs will be attributed to physical damages versus the loss of economic opportunity, please?
There are a variety of costs associated with coastal communities. Sea level rise is clearly one of them, and sea level rise is one of these costs where it's very difficult for us to constrain the amount of uncertainty. So there was a very recent study coming out suggesting that it's possible, there's like roughly a 10% chance of getting some very rapid rises in sea level over the next coming decades, and it's hard to rule those out. So that's a case where you're really thinking about how you want to manage risk. Do we want to do something that has a small risk of something very bad happening, or are we willing to invest to avoid that possibility? In addition to having higher sea levels, as storms come in, so particularly on the East Coast, less of a problem for California, each storm that comes in pushes a wall of water ahead of it that is the surge in front of a hurricane that then floods homes and does a huge amount of damage. As the sea level rises and then those storms intensify, those surges become larger and more difficult to manage. We will probably adapt to those storms by investing in fortifying our coastlines. So actually, the United States is one of the worst performing countries at our income level in terms of managing storm risk. If you look at a country like Japan, they actually suffer much lower mortality rates in their storms, but part of the reason is because they have an essentially fortified coastline. It's not as an enjoyable place to live if everything is covered with concrete seawalls. Right. So those are some of the types of compromises people living on the coast will have to make in the coming years if the previous trends of emissions continue.
And that type of fortification, I mean, you can't really apply that across the board, though. That's the thing. I mean, there's obviously geographical limitations, and I can tell you, in my district, there are probably a lot of political limitations about obstructing a seawall along Scenic Drive in Carmel, California. But in regards to that type of fortification, I mean, where do you see that being appropriately done?
That's a very open field of research. There are a lot of individuals trying to understand what would be the types of cost-effective adaptations that the government or local communities ought to deploy, and a fair amount of it is going to be individuals actually investing their own private resources in trying to protect their own home. But of course, in the case of something like a seawall, if I build one in front of my home and my next door neighbor chooses to not invest quite as much money in theirs, then I'm now subject to risk based on their choices.
Right.
And so this is going to create a situation in which we now have to negotiate over these types of adaptations. We're going to spend money on those negotiations. We're going to spend our our patience with one another on those types of conversations instead of focusing on how to make the schools better, instead of focusing on other things that we like to invest in as a community.
And let's say, you know, obviously you mentioned private investment. What are we talking public investment? How much is the government, and Mr. Gomez might have an answer for this, how much of these types of costs are going to be undertaken by the U.S. government when it comes to this type of fortification?
Sure. So in the area of coastal property damages, you know, again, our role is to provide Congress with information in terms of where those exposures are. And currently in the federal government, it's through the National Flood Insurance Program. I mean, that's a program that owes the Treasury $21 billion currently. And the program was never really set up to take care of all the expenses and losses. We've made recommendations that Congress should also make structural changes in that program so that it can send clear signals to the folks that are buying insurance. That's just one example. I also wanted to mention, because earlier we were talking about communities that are at risk, and one set of communities that we haven't talked about, where we see the impacts already taking place, and that is Alaska Native communities that live on the coast and on rivers. So GAO has a body of work. We've looked at those communities, look at what federal programs are available to help them retreat, but to help them adapt to those changes.
My time's expired. Thank you again for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I will mention for the record that the Pebble Beach Golf Course, where the U.S. Open is being held this week, actually fortified the 18th fairway because of the sea as well. You know where my head's at this week. So I now give myself 10 minutes. I want to follow up on what my good friend, Mr. Woodall, was talking about, because the reason that we wanted to do this hearing was because we believe that there are things that we need to look forward at and anticipate what policy consequences might ensue from an analysis of what the costs of certain things are. Climate change certainly being an important one. We're going to have a hearing on immigration policy as well, as to what the financial impact, what the consequences for the taxpayer will be moving forward. We're going to have a hearing at some point on artificial intelligence and what that's going to mean for the budget and the taxpayers, because I think it's going to be the most disruptive force probably in the history of the world moving forward. And the idea behind these hearings is not really to convince anybody of any policy preference or any philosophical argument. It's just to get information. And unfortunately, I think what you see sometimes, saw it today on both sides, is that there is less of a governing mentality in Washington than there is an electoral mentality. And regardless of what the issue is, there's always an attempt to figure out where the electoral advantage lies, or the PR advantage might lie, as opposed to where we can search for an appropriate governing strategy in that particular area. And I know Mr. Woodall is very much committed to that, as am I, and I hope we can influence our colleagues in that direction. On the subject of the future, there was a representative of Microsoft in my district last week. She's the Chief Technology Officer of Microsoft. And she was there because they're entering into a partnership with our community in terms of developing a better tech community and getting more tech jobs. She made a statement which I found absolutely astounding. She said that in the next 10 years, we will experience 250 years of change. Think about that in the next 10 years, we will experience as much change as we've experienced since the founding of the country. And so when I think of the opportunity for technology to develop to help us both adapt and to mitigate climate change, I'm reassured by that projection, even though I'm sure there's a plus or minus 150 years in that assessment. But this leads to a question I have of Dr. Hayhoe. You talked about loading the dice. And essentially, that's what we're doing right now, is rolling the dice, because you've got different assessments. Dr. Cass, you have different assessments where the impact may be, and we know there's a considerable amount of variation as to what that might be. But the costs of being wrong are pretty dramatic. Is that the point you were trying to make?
Yes, the world is changing very quickly, and our civilization is built on the assumption of a stable climate. Our agriculture, our water, the allocation of our energy resources, even our economics and our international policies are all built on the assumption that climate is stable, as it has been over the history of human civilization. Today it is changing faster than that, and the best analogy I have is actually from West Texas. So it's very flat there, and we have a lot of dead straight roads. And you can get down the road, staying in your own lane, looking in the rearview mirror, because where you were 5 minutes ago is a perfect predictor of the future. But when you hit a curve, you have to take your eyes off the rearview mirror and you have to look ahead, because if we do not do that, we will not make it around the curve safely. And we are facing and are already on the largest curve we have experienced, climatically speaking, in the history of human civilization, and our wheels are already on the rumble strip.
Appreciate the metaphor. Dr. Chung, I know Mr. Crenshaw asked you a question, and it was a rhetorical one because he didn't want you to answer, but I would like you to elaborate on this question of the health impacts, whether it's mental health or otherwise. How exactly, just walk through us why there would be more suicides, why there would be damage to fetuses, why the crime rate would go up as a result of these climate changes.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to revisit this issue. There's a variety of ways in which environmental conditions affect human health. We all know that we get less comfortable when it's hot, and part of that is because our body's actually experiencing difficulty functioning at higher temperatures, and it's actually making you uncomfortable, trying to incentivize you to go somewhere safer. We see, for example, on extremely hot days, increases in cardiovascular mortality rates, largely due to people their hearts have to work harder to move more blood to the surface of your skin to cool your body down. This is a very serious issue, and there are different discussions about how much we have adapted to this in the past. In fact, a lot of the numbers that were discussed earlier were completely consistent with the rates of mortality we see on hot days in US counties right now today. There's other types of vector-borne disease. There's projections about mosquitoes traveling much further north and surviving for much longer periods of time as temperatures warm, and in particular, humidity rises. So our projections indicate that humidity in the Northeast, in New England in the future, in the next 80 years, could easily feel like humidity in Louisiana today. Okay, that's a completely different world from a human health standpoint. When you think about fetuses, what we've observed using census data, my colleague Reed Walker has done some fascinating research where you actually see if a pregnant mother's exposed to a very hot day, we actually can see that by tracing that child over time in their earnings 30 years later. So a child born the year before on the exact same day or the year after on the exact same day, but when their mother was not exposed to a heat wave, they're actually earning more for multiple decades into the future. Now, we don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but what people think is happening is that the stress of the mother is affecting the development of the child that she's carrying. The last question you're asking is about mental health and crime. And this is actually, calling it ridiculous is something that I can understand when you first hear these facts, but actually in law enforcement, for example, it is well known and understood that on extremely hot days, violent rates go up. And so police departments everywhere actually adapt today by deploying more police forces to cope with this very human response. Now, we don't know exactly what's happening and why people change their behavior, but it is, in my experience, for looking at this type of data for over a decade, one of perhaps the single most robust statistical fact. Anyone in the world can look at their data, you can look at any state, any city, and you see that as the temperatures rise, levels of interpersonal violence go up. And now in our latest study over the last year, we showed that people perpetrating violence against themselves, self-harm and suicide rates are incredibly responsive to temperature. In fact, you can look almost anywhere in the world and see this relationship. We don't understand exactly why it occurs, but it is the type of thing that is not going away as air conditioning is deployed across the country. We actually see that this relationship is getting tighter and stronger over time, and in fact, it's occurring most strongly in the wealthiest communities in the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Gomez, I think Mr. Panetta asked about budgeting, the issue of budgeting and federal agencies for cost of disasters. Is that a good idea, and how would you do it?
So again, I think I mentioned earlier that one way is to provide you all with information that you can use, that gives you information on those programs across the federal government that are exposed to a high fiscal exposure, so that you can make those trade-offs. But one of the things that I wanted to mention that's really important from a federal perspective, and actually that affects all levels of government and the private sector, and that is that we've recommended in the past that we create a climate information system that provides authoritative climate information that has information on observations and projections that can be updated on a regular basis, and then to have a non-government entity be able to translate that information for all users, for local government, state government, private sector folks. As you know, we spend, from a budget perspective, we give billions of dollars a year around the country to build infrastructure. And it's those local folks, decision makers, state decision makers, that are having to plan and construct these things. And they're telling us that they need better information, forward-looking climate information, so they can build these things with resilience. So I think from a budget perspective, that's where we can save money in the long run.
Well, I thank you for your answer. I thank all four of you for your testimony and your responses. I think it's been a fascinating hearing, and I appreciate your participation very much and your work. And with that, with no objection, the hearing is adjourned.
No objection.
No objection. I looked at your way.
I appreciate it. You're the